Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to the Infatuasian podcast. We're going to have fun today because we are talking to a film scholar and a professor at the University of Houston, Karen Fang. And if you know me, you know I like to talk film and, I'm not a scholar by any means, but when I get to talk to an expert, it is a lot of fun. Karen has studied and written about Hong Kong film in the past, as well as British romanticism, but she took a little detour in the late 2010s and started researching Tyrus Wong, who I think you might have heard about him in 2015, 2016, when he passed away at the age of 106. He was a Chinese American artist who came to America in the 1900s and started working at Disney. And then you can read about it in Karen's book, but he was one of the main influences on the film Bambi. And we'll talk about that during the interview. And he goes on to have this long career at Warner Brothers as well as Hallmark. He's just a really incredible guy. And Karen wrote a definitive work on his life. It's called Background Artist. It's available wherever you get books, and it's really, really good. It's really neat as a history book, learning about a Chinese American who was on Angel Island as a 9 or 10-year-old, coming through San Francisco up to Sacramento and then down to LA, and just carving out a really impactful career in Hollywood at a time when Chinese Americans were not doing that. And so we're going to talk about his life, and we're going to talk a little bit about film. And so without further ado, let's get into our conversation with Professor Karen Fang right after this. Karen Fang is a literature and film scholar, fascinated by the intersection of Eastern and Western aesthetics. Karen is a professor in the English department at the University of Houston. Go Cougars! Originally a specialist in British romanticism, she is also the author of the new biography, Background Artist, The Life and Work of Tyrus Wong. Hello, and welcome to the show, Professor Karen Fang!
Thank you, Curtis. Thrilled to be here.
Oh, it's so good to talk to you. Where are you calling in from?
From Houston, Texas.
Houston, Texas. We were just talking about the weather. What's good? Besides thunderstorms, what's going on in Houston right now?
Well, I always tell everyone the absolute number one best thing about Houston is the Vietnamese community, because the Gulf area has a very big Vietnamese community. They were settled there after the war. And so you have these, multi-generational families so embedded in the community. And if you haven't been to Houston or to Texas, I just really recommend coming for incredible Vietnamese food and also particularly like Vietnamese flavored barbecue.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been to Houston only one time, and I think I was doing I got to do barbecue, and I got to do Tex-Mex, and I forgot about the Vietnamese food, so next time I'm there, got to do that. We like to greet our guests in the Asian way, speaking of food, so it's only 10 a.m. here, but it's about lunchtime over there. So, Karen, have you eaten yet?
Hiya, Sikfan La.
Sikfan, okay. Actually, do you speak other dialects? Cantonese? Are you Hong Kong raised or?
No. My parents are Taiwanese, actually.
Oh, okay. So you just picked up Canto from movies, or who taught you your Canto?
Basically, yeah.
Yeah, no, we share that in common. I think we may talk a little Hong Kong film later because that's one of your expertise. Yeah.
Yes.
Let's see. So we're going to talk about Tyrus Wong. If people out there don't know who he was, can you give us a quick elevator pitch for who Tyrus Wong was?
Sure. Tyrus Wong is best known today for having been absolutely instrumental in helping make the movie Bambi. But if that were the only thing he did, that in itself would be amazing because he was a Chinese immigrant who at the time could not become a citizen when he helped make this movie that's so important in our childhoods and so important in one of those iconic American companies. But in addition to that, he was also a practicing accomplished fine artist. He spent nearly 30 years at Warner Brothers. He was in the middle of the 20th century one of the nation's leading greeting card artists, famed for doing these distinctly Chinese-styled Christmas cards, which is, the quintessence of Asian American, if you think
Yeah,
about it,
yeah.
right? And then he lived to 106. So, I mean, Tyrus is an amazing individual, and his life is not only this incredible story of resilience and the transcendence of creativity, but it's also because he lived for so long, a story of American history through a particular lens.
Yeah, that era, right? 1920s to 2000s. Like
Yeah,
that's a life. That is definitely a life. So we're definitely going to talk more about Tyrus in a second, but I wanted to talk about you a little bit. We get to know our guests a little bit. Can we dig into your roots?
sure.
Okay, so you were born in America,
Yes.
but what are your roots?
My parents are Taiwanese immigrants. So my dad came in 65, right, in the
Mm-hmm.
year of the Immigration Naturalization Act. He came to do his graduate degree, as so many Asians who came during that time did. And then we were actually, my older brother and I were born in Washington State. My younger brother was born in Oregon. And then we sort of moved around the country based on my dad's job.
Okay, okay. Now, I hope you're not shy about your age, but according to LinkedIn, I think we're about the same age.
Uh-huh.
So if we drop any 80s references out there for your audience, you'll know why. But yeah,
Proud Generation X. I
yeah,
will
right.
own up to it, right?
Since you're a film scholar, I feel like we may be, well, maybe a little bit after us as well, but the last film loving generation, like my kids, they're streamers. We don't go to the
Yeah.
theater all that often anymore, well, especially because of pandemic. But I mean, I remember when I was in high school, I would like old films. I loved
Yeah.
Alfred Hitchcock and I loved old films. But my kids, every time I mention a film from the 80s or 90s, they roll their eyes and they don't want to do
Uh,
it.
that's funny. How old are your kids?
15, 13.
Oh, okay, they're exactly the same as
Oh,
mine, so
wow.
we
Okay.
really are the same. Yeah. I think it's totally dependent on the child, right?
Okay.
Because my two kids, like, they're totally different, and I mean, they're children of a film professor, and so my oldest is like, he will watch anything with me. Like, he from a very young age had a distinct preference for the very early Disney, because, as he astutely said, the old Mickey was naughty. And then and he's just like, I mean, it's funny, like, he'll catch these really obscure references in The Simpsons or something, only because he's watched these old movies with me and stuff. And then my younger son, like, doesn't like anything that's like 18 months old.
I know.
So,
Yeah. Huh. Okay. So maybe there's hope for the generation, but my kids in particular do not like older movies. How did you get into film? Were you a film loving kid?
yeah, I mean, I think, again, like you're saying, Gen X, like, we're children of Spielberg, and we also grew up with camcorders, right?
And
And
Blockbuster
so, like,
Video.
right. And so we were like the first. I mean, of course, now it's like it's intuitive for these kids, right? Like, they are, cutting these, like, short videos, these reels, like, on their phones with their thumbs or something. But, we were the first generation, if you think about it, for whom, the manipulation of the moving image became um, accessible. Because prior to that, you would have had to have access to this really heavy camera. You'd have access to film, to real film. Like, how do you learn to edit real film? Let alone getting the props and things like that. And so, I mean, I think if you were a child of the 80s, like you're saying, like, not only did we have this sort of, like, very intimate relationship with film because we could go to Blockbuster, but we also were the first generation to think that it was actually we could to learn as a child in the way Spielberg did.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I actually had a little 8 millimeter from my
Did you?
dad. Yeah.
There you
So we did
go.
some little. Yeah. I think you're right. I think you're right. So if we flash back to like 11 or 12-year-old Karen, what would we see? Would we see someone that could grow up to be a film professor or a were you reading Byron and Keats when you were 12 years old? Or?
I mean, I definitely read Pride and Prejudice. Like, I mean, that's one of, like, yeah. I mean, I think, like, most girls, right? That's sort
Yeah.
of like one of the first sort of, like, story novels, like chick lit. It's like the
Yeah.
things that you encounter. So my dad's a big reader, and so he introduced us to all sorts of stories, and I
Uh-huh.
think that was part of it.
Okay, okay. So I think you studied English in college.
Mhm.
What was the plan? What were you thinking you would do?
Oh, well, I actually was at the University of Pennsylvania also at the same time doing an accounting degree,
Okay,
like a good Asian American child,
right.
like, and I just like I don't know, I just sort of went off in a different direction.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. But you fell in love with it and you wanted to get a PhD in it, or what kind of happened with literature and
yeah, I mean, I was lucky. I mean, I some professors took me aside and said that they thought I should go to graduate school, and if you go to a place like Wharton, it becomes really obvious if you're not that kind of person,
Mhm.
you know. So,
Uh-huh.
um, you know, so I ended up going to grad school, and I mean, um, now it's all worked out for me, and so I don't know that. Um, I'm really grateful that that's the direction that it took. But I think, you know, it's not a good life. I wouldn't recommend it for people because you're impoverished forever and stuff. So
Yeah. But along the way, you kind of got into Hong Kong films in the 90s, same as me maybe.
yeah, yeah.
Who were your favorites in that era?
John Woo was like
Uh,
my I don't know. That was like when the scales fell from my eyes, and like I suddenly
yeah.
saw that like everything that it could be. I mean, I really, at the same time I discovered Hong Kong cinema, I also discovered Hong Kong. And Hong Kong was so interesting to me
Mhm.
because it was this literal example of East and West meeting, right? Very different from Taiwan, which I had been to many times to see my relatives,
Mhm.
where, um, in Hong Kong, you can function in English for somebody who was studying literature. Like the sort of legacy of the colonial history was like so visible and tangible. And then, of course, in the '90s, right, they were leading up to reunification, and so there was, Hong Kong was just so fascinating to me. And then it became a sort of mutually reinforcing thing, like watching the movies at the cinema, which are so dynamic and so inventive and so different from anything that you see in Hollywood. At the same time, presenting like these really good-looking, charismatic individuals that you're not seeing in Hollywood film.
Yeah.
And then also just sort of the experience of Hong Kong itself, right? I mean, all of those things sort of reinforce like the fascination for me.
Oh man, we're like the same person, Karen. Like my my first trip to Asia, my first trip off of America or off of North America was Macau in the 90s, and then we took the ferry over to Hong Kong in the 92, 93. And yeah, what a place, right? You see, just to see ads with Chinese faces on it,
Yeah, yeah.
and then you see these cool guys. I saw my first Jackie Chan movie. I saw, for me, it was Chungking Express. That
Oh
movie
yeah.
wrecked me for good. I was like, what does this all mean? It was so
That
crazy.
is to this day still my most favorite Wong Kar Wai.
Oh man, yeah, that guy. And then yeah, then you start doing the deep dive with Wong Kar Wai, and then yeah, you're never coming back. Oh man. But all right, but we're actually here. We're here to talk about Tyrus Wong, who was all through this era. So you could almost mention any era in the last 100 years, and Tyrus Wong was there. So I'm guessing that this took you years to produce this book.
Yeah.
When did you first meet? I mean, you never met the man, but when did you first when did he show up on your radar?
So I, I think, like a lot of people, I really couldn't get away from him in late 2016 when he passed because there was so much coverage of him, right? Because he was over 106. It was right after the first. It was right at the end of 2016, so right after the first Trump election, where there's been all this anti-immigrant rhetoric, and
Yeah.
so I think that really like reinforced the sort of power of his story, and so he was just everywhere. The obituaries, the coverage of him when he passed was just ubiquitous. But at the time, because I'm a film scholar and Asian American, like I realized that I had been seeing his name a number of times already because of the sort of recovery work of Asians in Hollywood, the sort of importance of animation today. And so, I, like everyone, was sort of interested. And the Pamela Tom's documentary had just come out the year before, and I'd seen that. But, with a documentary, there's only so much you can do for limits of time. And so, the documentary sort of hints to all these other things that he did. And once you start like looking into it, you're thinking, oh my God, like this is amazing, And so as a scholar, like I really felt that in addition to the documentary, there really needed to be a book that sort of looked at the whole of his career. And particularly, as a scholar, as a film scholar, and as someone who writes about visual culture in general, the research question for me was always, what is the unifying theme throughout all of his artistic practice? Because if you think of someone who's a practicing fine artist, then goes to the movie studios, transitions from animation to live action, during the time that he's in the movie studios, is also making these Christmas cards, also taking commissions for print illustration, also doing decorative arts, then later on does these kites, right? Like, very few artists, creative people tend to work in multiple media, but they usually are most distinguished for a particular medium, like a particular practice. And for Tyrus to have done all of these different things, like I was fascinated, like, is there a unifying theme or practice or style across all these different media and all these different industries and professional fields? If so, what is it? Like, how do you explain or account for this? And then like as I said earlier, to have lived 106, to have lived through Chinese exclusion, arriving through Angel Island to September 11th, right? Like, what kind of a vision of America, did this person have?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And congratulations. I heard you just made the Chinese American Librarians Association's list, honorable mention for adult nonfiction. I mean, you got beat out by Connie Chung, so that's okay.
I know. You can't hold a candle to Connie, and she's such a pioneer herself. So I love the fact that Tyrus is like right behind her.
Yeah.
So
no, I think they would be friends. I could, I spoke to her on an interview, so I could say that Tyrus and Connie would be buddies.
Yeah.
They're very similar.
Well, I mean, towards the end of his life, when Tyrus was doing so many interviews, I was told that, like, I can't remember who was it. Maybe it was CBS This Morning who had come. Oh no, that was later. So somebody had come to interview him and had said afterwards to the family members, like, he gives a good interview.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's great. All right, so let's talk about this book a little bit. We're not going to get that in. I mean, it's over 400 pages long, so there's a lot in there. We're just going to barely scratch the surface here. But we got to talk about his roots. Was he Toisan?
Yes. Like, the vast majority of Chinese who were coming into the U.S. at that time were Toisan.
Yeah. My ancestors included. So 1920s. He was born in 1010, October 1910. And
well, that is the date on his documents. So I don't know how, have you ever, do you have your family history?
A little bit. Yeah. Okay. And so I have this story where both of my grandparents came over in the 1910s and 20s, but they both say that they were who they were. They both said that they were not paper sons, but they also had an ancestor, or their father had come to America in the 1800s, and that's how they were able to come in the 1900s, because of some kind of link to them being in America beforehand. So what was Tyrus's story? How did he get here?
So Tyrus's father had actually come in 1898 and had been working before Tyrus was even born. But he was already married at the time to a girl in the village. And I think the plan was always, so many Chinese at the time, that he was going to make a better life for his family. And so the father went back, conceives Tyrus, comes back to the U.S., and then works some more, and then goes back to get Tyrus when Tyrus is about 8 or 9 years old. And he stays, every time he goes back, he stays for a while. And so when his father brings Tyrus at the end of 1928, Tyrus is we're guessing about 9 or 10, between 8 to 10 years old. But the only documents that I've ever been able to find are his immigration documents, the ones that are available
Mm-hmm.
through, and also his coaching papers. So, so in many cases that may not actually be
Yeah.
the actual birth date or anything, right? And so that's always why like there's some discrepancy between like what he would self-report in the later interviews about his age and then the date, the age that he would have been if you go by the paper document.
Interesting. All right, but he came over on one of these boats, and these boats take about a month, right, from China. And I found it fascinating that he came over in first class. So his dad had some money saved up.
Yeah, yeah. It was $1,000
Wow.
to come first class, and it would be about another 500, half the fare for the child. And so they shared the stateroom with another gentleman, I think, just to you make it a little bit less expensive. But even so, I didn't believe it myself. When you're a biographer, you always have to take everything with a grain of salt until you see documentation.
Yeah.
That's always been my approach coming from the academia. And so I'd always heard that he had come over first class, and that was a way to try and negotiate the exclusion restrictions. That it was if you came over first class, it's more likely to persuade the immigration officials that you were in fact merchant class. But you think about like how were these families who were economic migrants be able to cough up $1,000 for a first class fare? But it was actually through the help of Grant Din, who's a specialist in Chinese American genealogy and also based in the Bay Area, and he helped me like look up find the ship manifests, the actual ship manifests on that for the ship, the the SS China, that Tyrus and his father had come over on at the very end of 1920, and there indeed they were enlisted as first class. So, I mean, and I talked about this in the book. Like you just see over and over again how Tyrus's father, planned so carefully, and how the family made so many sacrifices to take this gamble, to try to provide a future for this little boy.
Yeah.
You didn't remember, and Tyrus will never see his mother again.
Right.
Once he leaves her in China.
Yeah. Wow. And I think you mentioned in the book that this kind of he got separated from his dad for like a month on Angel Island. He was by himself. His dad was able to come in on his papers. And I think you were saying that, in 2016, this kind of struck a chord with you because of all these kids in America being separated, all these immigrant kids getting separated from their parents and what they might be feeling. That's kind of nuts in 1920 for him to be alone for like a month on this island.
Yeah, I mean, you and I are parents. You think about like, how would a young child, 9 or 10 years old, like survive a month alone in a detention center, the only child, no relative, you don't even speak the language in which the place is being managed in. Like, how does this child protect himself, like maintain his mental health? Like, I mean, it's horrifying to think of as a parent. And yet Tyrus survived that. And so I think it's a sign of this early resilience that he was just maybe born with.
Yeah. Wow.
But and it's very sad to think that near 100 years later, the U.S. is doing the same thing.
100 years later. Oh, man. All right, we're going to flash forward a little bit. So he seems like he had a fairly cool little kid childhood, like doing a little bit in Sacramento and then ending up in L.A. And I was kind of fascinated by the fact that, so he got identified by a middle school teacher for some artistic ability. And his teacher said, "Oh yeah, there's scholarships at Otis. What was it, Art Institute or Otis College of Art and Design in LA?"
It was Otis Art Institute at the time.
Back at the time, yeah. Okay. Yeah. And he got this summer scholarship, and then he fell in love with it. And his dad said, "Okay." That's the part. That's the part that's amazing to me.
Yeah. No. I mean, again, you just sort of think like, we don't know that much about his dad, and we know almost nothing about his mother. But at the same time, you just think you have to really hand it to these individuals that they took these enormous gambles.
Yeah.
So it was one thing for Tyrus to get a scholarship, right? Like, okay, you get to go to the summer program for 6 weeks or something because, and I talk in the book, like he didn't know what the word scholarship is. He didn't know what the idea of a portfolio is, right? Because, these are ideas, the very idea of a scholarship to study, the idea that, you can get in you can have your school fees like excused based on drawings, right? This is unheard of in the Chinatowns
Yeah.
of the exclusion era, right? And but it was one thing to do that, but then for when the summer scholarship ends and Tyrus says he doesn't want to go back to regular school, he wants to go to art school, that his father says okay, and they have to borrow money to pay the tuition for that first year. And and you think about, on the one hand, for all of these Chinese, like on the one hand, um, fellow members of the Chinatown community are telling, look at Tyrus's dad, like, you're crazy. Why would you do this? Like,
Yeah.
but then on the other hand, some other ones say, well, okay, we'll lend you some money, and the people who lend him the money are some young men who are working in City Market, which was a produce wholesaler in Los Angeles that was significantly staffed by immigrants of all kinds, not just Chinese, Italians, Armenians. But I think for those maybe those young men, they must have thought like, this may not, this young man has he's one of ours, and he may have the opportunity to have a different life. Like,
Yeah.
let's help him. And so it is really remarkable that they all were they supported him at that time.
Yeah. And I think his dad was the one to kind of put a brush in his hand, right, for the calligraphy aspect.
Yeah. Yeah. So Look Get was literate, although they were poor. He could read and write Chinese. Seems to have known a lot of Chinese proverbs, which he used to quote to his son. And so when Tyrus and his dad were, they're living by themselves in Chinatown. They don't. The wife and sister, and their family are in China, and so Look at Tyrus's dad would have Tyrus every night before bed write 2 pages of Chinese characters. And this was a way to provide some structure in his daily life to reinforce his Chinese heritage. And obviously he knew that his son had some kind of visual talent. I think that had always been clear, that he was a little bit of an erasable kid, like a little bit mischievous, but that he also clearly had this sort of artistic gift. And so the calligraphy was part of that as well.
Yeah. And I think it stuck with him. If you look at his style, that watercolor style, almost his whole life, right? The brush. Like he did everything at Otis, I'm sure, but it feels like he landed back on this kind of watery, dreamy Asian or Chinese art style his whole life almost.
Yeah, that's exactly like what when I was saying earlier, the sort of research question for me was, what is the unifying theme or practice between all of these different media? And it's clearly brushwork, right? And it's this kind of like Oriental style brushwork, like in Japanese art, they call it the sumi ink brush painting. And this is something that Tyrus sort of, he taught himself, building upon the grounding in Chinese calligraphy that his father had taught him. So even though he's at Otis and he's getting this sort of traditional Western training, Western art history and Western art practice and oil and in sort of the old master painting. And I think, and Tyrus, because he was so gifted, right, was very good at producing that work as well. So if you could look at his juvenilia, look at the sort of early paintings that he did, early paintings and drawings that he does in his first year or two at Otis, like you can see him already sort of very good with a brush, because he'd been using a brush since he was a kid, right? Like, very adept at sort of mixing color and producing these wonderful lines and things like that. But what he also did, and I think, again, this sort of shows this sort of like really fierce independence and sort of visual sort of idiosyncrasy that's evident in him from a very young age, is that he never just allowed Western art history and Western art practice to sort of like colonize him. And so even though he's at Otis and succeeding very much at school, and he's already sort of very quickly becomes known as one of the most interesting students that a lot of the other fellow students are looking to for advice, and the teachers are very interested in, Tyrus would on his own go to the local public library and read books on Chinese art and sort of educate himself about Ming versus Song, and Song dynasty is what he particularly admired and stuff. And so he sort of, insisted on sort of learning and teaching and practicing a sort of heritage art practice in addition to sort of the establishment art practice that he was learning at school.
Yeah. And it was cool to read that the community at Otis was so welcoming too. Like I looked up, currently, you can go to the Otis College of Art and Design's webpage, and they list notable alumni in the 1930s for a whole decade. They only mention three. They mention Hideo Date, Dorothy Jenkins, and Tyrus Wong. Those three, who are buddies for life, into their
Yeah,
70s
yeah.
and beyond. That's pretty cool that 2 out of the 3 were Asians in the 1930s from the
Yeah, yeah. No, Otis was distinctly sort of, I mean, artists, I think in general, tend to be very progressive, right, and inclusive. But Otis, even among all of the art schools in LA at that time, and there were a lot of art schools at the time, like Otis was distinctly, unusually progressive from the top down. Its leadership was, but to your point about sort of like the school's pride in these graduates, Dorothy Jenkins was a scholarship student like Tyrus, which is one of the things that they had in common. And what they're not mentioning, and I know they mentioned it elsewhere, is like there were, and I talk about this in the book, the huge number of like Disney, like 9 old men, are really like key original figures in Disney, are also Tyrus's classmates, during that time. And also like Philip Guston, who's this very important American political painter, is his classmate at that time. So there, Tyrus is Otis, it's really, you can't underestimate Otis's importance in Tyrus's trajectory. It was one thing for him to come from China to the US, and I would say almost as significant is the leap that he makes from Chinatown to Otis.
Yeah. No, you write that very well on that in your book. So he makes the leap. He does a little art around town a little bit, but ends up going to Disney, which at the time was an upstart, right? At the time, Disney was not the giant studio that we know of today. But he gets kind of thrown into, what was his role back then? It was...
So he's initially hired as an in-betweener, which is like the most basic entry level position for an artist in an animation studio at the time. In-betweener is like, you're just basically a human copyist. Like, back then you'd have to have like, 20 frames, 20 cells, per second or something to create movement. And so there would be just like these gifted draftsmen who just have to basically draw the same image over and over again with these really minuscule changes, right? So that when you flip through them, or when they're played in succession like a flip book, it looks like movement. So almost everybody, when you were hired at Disney, started at the most basic position. Like Wilfred Jackson, who was another Otis classmate of Tyrus's, who would go on to become really important at Disney, like started as a janitor. And so Disney was a very small studio at the time, but when Tyrus joined, Disney was like the most interesting place in Hollywood at the time because of Snow White.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, it was super small, but it was also like growing really rapidly, and it had a huge amount of clout, which is precisely why they could do this sort of thing, that they could take these accomplished artists like Tyrus, who at this point was already well known as a fine artist, had already been reviewed a number of times in the Los Angeles Times for his paintings, right? And then he'd already worked in the WPA, like, he'd already been exhibited in places all over the nation. And then, they could tell this, accomplished fine artist, like, you're going to start here. But, he does it because he was a newlywed at the time. They had a baby on the way, their first child. And he was an immigrant. It was a depression, and he made the practical smart choice.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think you write, or it's known that Bambi was kind of floundering at this point. Bambi was based on a novel, and it was this huge concept, but it was having trouble at Disney. They weren't really getting a visual style for it. How did Tyrus enter the picture here in this discussion?
Right. So yeah, Walt, always ambitious, has this huge success with Snow White, and he immediately decides that he's going to one-up himself with Bambi's supposed to be his next project, which is, going to be even harder because there's no humans. So it's all going to be animals. So how do you make you have to make the animals move. You have to make them, have to make these animal characters. You have to make them believable. You have to make them talk, right? So this turns out to be this, really, unanticipatedly like difficult, understandably difficult animation problem, and it's just not working. And it just, it's not going anywhere. They're spending, hemorrhaging, the studio's hemorrhaging money. Like the studio's having to make other films, in the meantime. And then Tyrus, because he's at the studio, remember, he's got a number of well-placed friends, who's from former classmates from Otis. And he, anyone at the studio was probably hearing what was going on. And Tyrus sort of thinks like, maybe I can have a solution. Mm-hmm. And so he goes back to the public library. He checks out the novel. He goes home, he reads it on his own. He makes some sample boards on his own time at home. And he gets one of his friends to get it in front of Walt. And Walt sees what he had done and immediately says, I like it. I like it better than all this indecipherable junk behind it. Mm-hmm. And what he sees, what Walt sees without really knowing exactly what he's seeing, but instinctively recognizing the value, is that what Tyrus had done was use his distinct soft Oriental brushwork style to create the suggestion of a setting, the suggestion of a forest, the suggestion of a meadow, the suggestion of spring or winter, without sort of like, creating all these like fiddly details, which is the look of Snow White. Because if you're going to spend all this time working out all of these animals, you can't have the animals like hidden behind the leaves and the trees and the shadows and everything. And so, in one fell swoop, in a matter of a half dozen sample boards, Tyrus immediately solves the animation problem of Disney, right? And immediately provides the studio a new direction for the making of the film. And from that point forward is when Bambi as a film really takes off. And so Tyrus is plucked from in-betweening and reassigned to the Bambi project. And this sounds less significant than it actually is, because Bambi was so important a project for Walt that at the time he kept the Bambi artists in a physically different location from the rest of the studio. And so, like, if you were working on Bambi, you were pretty much only working on Bambi. And that was especially the case for Tyrus. And so what his new role at Bambi becomes is what is now known as an inspiration sketch artist. It's essentially a concept artist. And so that he is just working from the story or working from the script and just making these, self-contained one-off pieces that are setting what they call keying the film or setting the mood of the film. So they're just sort of like single still images that, all of the animators, all of the story artists, like the composer, can all look to understand, like, this is the kind of mood that we want in this scene. Yeah. This is this space that the animals will be moving through. Yeah. This is the time of year that it's taking place in. And he just does this like day after day. And for him, this is the best. It's just pure creativity, right? Yeah. So.
Yeah. And I have to admit, never noticed it. And then now that you know it, you can't unsee it. When you look at Bambi, like, is this a Chinese film? Like the style behind it. Yeah, it's so beautiful.
That's exactly what I say when I've been. One of the things I've been doing is sort of introducing the film around at different places, and I show a few images before the film, and I always say, once you see it, you can't unsee it, just like you said. And I would also recommend, if anybody has a chance to do it, if you can, to try and see it on film. To go back to your original point, because to see it on film is really magical, because digital, the algorithms, like they sharpen the softness of the film of the original images, and so if you can see it like actually projected on film, it's just amazing.
All right, I got to add that to my bucket list. Where do you know where you might be able to? It'd have to be in LA, yeah, or.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, the Bay Area has a lot of repertory cinemas. Okay. Like, I would reach out, like Pacific Film Archive. That would be really interesting.
Yeah. Right? No, I agree. I think you're right. The digital is just everything is just equalized versus film. There's bright spots, there's dark spots. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool. So I think this is kind of where you get the title for your book, but he was only acknowledged in a list of background artists, right? Is that what his official role?
Right. So Right. So his official credit in the original release of Bambi, in the 1942 release, is as a background artist. He's listed with several other people as a background artist. And so I think in the sort of rediscovery of Tyrus, that started in the 1990s and, was really sort of peaking with Pam's film. I think there's this the sort of reflexive tendency from people to sort of get defensive and feel that he's being misrepresented and that maybe like this is an inaccurate and diminishing credit that doesn't really adequately represent the scale of his contribution, and that maybe that kind of slight is because he's not white. He never actually met Walt the entire time he's working on Bambi, and that is certainly I think indicative of the ways in which it was hard to be an artist of color. He's not a citizen at the time. He's got a thick accent, right? So, I mean, I think we all understand the sort of like the microaggressions of workplace dynamics if you're a person of color, right? So, I don't want to belittle or diminish those conditions, but it's also important to know that Bambi was the first film that had credits at all. Prior to that, all like the Disney releases were always just a Walt Disney film. That was the branding of the corporation. And so, the fact that he is noted as that he is credited at all, right? And, is significant. I mean, and remember, feature animation is still so young at this time that they're still working out the labels and titles for these different things, these different roles, especially at a hothouse small studio like Disney, where everybody's expected to do multiple things. And then of course, for me in my book, I'd say that I'm really trying to retrieve background artists as like not just to understand like the significance of his contribution to the film, but also like as a metaphor for all immigrants, and what all immigrants do, and particularly immigrant artists like Tyrus.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it was a sign of the times back then, and so even to get mentioned at all, I guess, is something. But yeah, now, like you said, or like we said, now that you see it, amazing contribution in Bambi.
And the credit is actually it's actually how Pamela Tom first started on the documentary. So she was a mom rewatching the film with her young child at the time. And she's a filmmaker and she's watching the credits, or actually she was watching the featurette, like the making of that came out with like the DVD re-release or something. And then she sort of sees like the Tyrus's name scroll past on the credits. And she's thinking, and Pam was already an established filmmaker. Pam had also, one of her first jobs had been an intern at Disney. And then she's also, Pam herself is a fifth generation Angelino. And so she was thinking like, how do I not know about this Chinese name in Disney, in a major Disney film? And that was the sort of genesis for her of the film that she ended up, working on for so long.
Yeah. All right. But okay, then your book details how he not how he but how he got fired from Disney. Like, he was only there for
3 years.
3 years. So he gets fired from Disney. You can read about it in the book. But he lands what turns out to be a pretty good gig. He's a production illustrator at Warner Brothers for, like you said, 26, 30 years. Somewhere in there. He was there for a good amount. Like, basically, most of his working life was at Warner Brothers. Doing what is he doing there? Similar, right? Concept art and mood art.
Yeah, he's at what in live action is called a motion picture sketch artist. But of course, the difference between animation and live action between Disney and Warner Brothers is a huge studio, right? It's been around forever, right? Everything's like highly like regulated. It's also a union shop. Right. So which is like why Tyrus had been let go at Disney, was because of all the sort of union clashes over unionization that was happening there. So he is doing the same kind of thing where he's reading the script and doing like these concept sketches to set the tone of the film. But there's not this, at Warner Brothers, we're just churning out films. There's not the same kind of sense of intellectual property over the images that there is at Disney. And so every film at Warner Brothers is kind of a one-off, right? And so Tyrus is just sort of like churning out motion picture sketches, for a number of movies at a time. Whereas at Disney, he'd only worked on Bambi, right? but he's also allowed to take them home. He's allowed to sign them. You can't sign
Yeah.
concept sketches at Disney, right? And then because it's unionized, his starting pay at Warner Brothers is higher or the same as his top pay at Disney, right? And so he's actually and he ends up staying at Warner Brothers for so long that it really provides his family a very comfortable and stable lifestyle, and also just a great community.
Yeah, it seems like it. And for those out there who don't know what it is, it's a little bit like storyboarding, where you read the script and you kind of make just a picture.
Well, so it's similar and different from storyboarding, and the important so storyboarding, like you're actually working out like a series of frames of exactly where the character's going to be, like in the mise en scène, like in the frame, and whereas concept art, motion picture sketch is like it's concept art where it's a single image that's supposed to like set the tone of the film or set the tone of the scene. Right. So you're not necessarily like working out exactly where the characters are going to be in the frame. You're just sort of giving a reference image. I mean, this is important because at a highly regulated union shop like Warner Brothers, there's a very clear status between motion picture sketch artists and storyboard artists. The motion picture sketch artist has higher status. And so when Tyrus is hired at Warner Brothers, he's hired as a motion picture sketch artist, because so his reputation and the work that he'd done at Disney already allows him to enter at a higher position.
Okay.
And that sort of tells you like the difference between the two studios, the ways in which like his life at Warner Brothers is going to turn out to be such a sort of like welcome environment for him for so long. Yeah. Right. And it also sort of reinforces the kind of reputation that he has coming in and that he continues to build.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's pretty neat to see that his sketches, you can see them in the film. You can see them.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're really translated well into the films. So
actually, since you and I have kids the same age, for anybody who's listening and might, if they really want to see wonderful examples of motion picture sketch art or concept art, some of the recent Disney TV adaptations like The Mandalorian, like they would end before the credits with a run through of some of the concept art that had been developed for that sequence. And so that's a really great way for people to become familiar with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Or I think you can find the Star Wars ones too, like the 1970 Star Wars concept arts. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, everything's available online, but I really appreciate what the Disney series right now are doing to sort of really to remind people of the work of these artists, these pre-production artists who really are some of the first people to visualize a film.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, we're almost done with the podcast, but we're barely 30 years in. But he also, at the same time he's doing all this, he's doing greeting cards for Hallmark.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yes. For Hallmark. For Hallmark, it's towards the later. He starts with California artists, a number of California-based greeting card companies. And this is very common for well-known artists at the time, or for commercial artists. A number of people in Disney alone were all doing Christmas cards. Tee, Mary Blair, Dick Kelsey, because the 50s through the 70s are widely known as the golden age of greeting cards, right? I mean, this is when everybody is buying and sending greeting cards, and so there's it's a huge industry. It makes Hallmark one of America's great companies at that time, right? And so Tyrus is suggested by one of his old Disney friends, like, hey, why don't you do greeting cards? And he initially says, like, well, why would I do that? I've never done that before. But the way that Tyrus was just very prolific and just always like, this is what made him a great commercial artist. He worked really quickly. He just had a wealth of ideas. He also, importantly, had his wife Ruth, who was Christian, had studied English at UCLA. She was born in the U.S. and just sort of socially sophisticated. And Ruth was, his partner in everything in life. Like an amazing person. But she also was a huge resource in the greeting cards, where she would provide him like lists of like ideas of scenes from the Bible, like extracts of poetry that would give him ideas to like develop greeting card images.
But the style 100%
This
Tyrus, though.
100% Tyrus. You look at these, like, these Christmas trees and angels that are done with a Chinese style brush, right? He
Yeah.
actually has some angels that like sort of look Asian, which I think,
Uh-huh.
and, it's just, I think, so quintessentially and unapologetically bicultural, right?
Yeah.
I really remember the term Asian American doesn't even become coined until like the later 1960s.
Yeah.
And Tyrus is already doing this in his art for decades before that.
He was the original Asian American, I think. He was bridged both
he's
worlds.
and he's literally refusing to be invisible, right?
Yeah.
The politics, the dynamics of exclusion was to try and keep ethnic Asians invisible
Hmm.
on the margins, right? And as a subject of exclusion, Tyrus refused that invisibility.
Yeah.
Like, that's what's so significant about his artistic practice, right? Not just that as an artist his work is everywhere, but also that as an artist he insisted on this kind of fusion aesthetic.
Yeah. Yeah. Literally on the walls of LA,
Yeah,
bedrooms of Hollywood moguls and things like that.
yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. So we're gonna have to leave people on the edge of their seat. If you want to know more about Tyrus, go get the book. There's actually I'm gonna point people to your website too. Actually, and we'll end with this because it kind of comes from his kite making. But you can go to alwayslookup.net to find out more about this book and about Tyrus. Where did that name for that website come from, Karen?
Yeah. So it's actually it was a saying that was important for Tyrus. So later in life, Tyrus, in retirement, he sort of like doesn't know what to do, and his wife Ruth sort of jokes. She just to him, and she says like, "Oh, go fly a kite," and he sort of thinks like, I love flying kites. Like he goofed around with it. It's also a Chinese invention,
Yeah.
right? And so he takes an idea and runs with it. And of course, when he's retiring in his late 50s, he doesn't know like how much longer his retirement is going to go, last. He doesn't know it's going to be another 4 decades, but um, he just decides he just seizes the idea of kites and just makes that his new artistic medium, his new artistic practice. And in typical Tyrus, he would joke, when he was younger, for many years, for decades, fishing was his favorite hobby, and that was what he used to do all the time for artist block, just to hang out with friends and decompress. But he would say, I used to go fishing a lot, but with fishing, you always look down. Now I do kites because with kites, you always look up. And so I think that's such a wonderful lesson that Tyrus gives all of us. And so that's why I call the website Always Look Up. You can't forget it, alwayslookup.net.
Fantastic. So everyone, do yourself a favor and get a copy of Background Artist. And if you want to, actually, for those of you who drive, all you commuters out there, there's actually an audiobook narrated by Caroline McLaughlin. I heard a little clip from her Instagram. She's fantastic. She's so smart.
Yeah. She's Chinese American. You don't know from her name, but she's Chinese American. Her parents, you'll find this interesting, Kurt. Her parents actually owned the theater in DC Chinatown.
Oh wow!
And so she grew up with Hong Kong films too. But like she does an amazing job narrating. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah. So on those, maybe if you're going on a long flight, a little 15-hour Hong Kong flight, you can download the audiobook to listen on the flight. Yeah. No, perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Karen, you've survived our difficult questions. Are you ready for your lightning round questions?
Sure.
All right. This is going to be hard. What's your favorite Disney animated film?
Well, obviously, I have to say Bambi at this point. But I mean, I will say that I've long had a particular nostalgia for the Rescuers.
Yeah, I was going to say 1970s babies.
Yeah. But Bambi is high art.
It is.
The great screenwriter William Golding talks about sort of seeing Bambi as an adult when he was just starting his screenwriting career and thinking that he was never going to see a movie as perfect as that film.
Yeah. Man, Bambi, Rescuers. Do you know what Tyrus thought of Mulan? Did he ever say anything?
So, I mentioned in the book, he was actually invited back by Disney to work on the animated Mulan. And at this point, he's been doing the kites. And he was older. Ruth had been sick. And he was just like, I don't need to do that. I've moved on to different things.
Yeah. But stylistically, I like the choices that they made on that film, too. It's interesting.
Yeah.
All right, next question. Now I don't know. Are you a Chow Yun-fat or a Tony Leung person? Are you? Can you go either way?
I'm both. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So,
yes.
what's your favorite Tony Leung character?
Actually, not a Hong Kong film. The City of Sadness, the Ho Shao.
Oh wow. Okay, I did not.
Yeah, he's amazing in that.
Did not see that coming. He's amazing in everything, but yeah, he's really.
Yeah, but I mean that was so early in his career, and like you see that performance, and you think like this man could do anything.
The energy,
and like that film depends on him too.
Yeah. Oh man, what a career. We should have you back and talk about Hong Kong film on our next podcast.
Happy to.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I'll keep you on the list. All right, so if I'm going to Houston, what's a go-to? Like, there's one dish that I gotta have at one restaurant in Houston. What do I have to have?
You know, I know a lot of people will tell you go get the Vietnamese crawfish or go get the Vietnamese flavored barbecue and stuff like that. But I just love good old Vietnamese food, period.
Yeah.
I think you can't beat Vietnamese barbecued pork. So I would just go get banh mi anywhere.
Yeah. Okay. You know, that's not a wrong answer. You know, when it's good, right?
Yeah.
Love it. Okay, now we end with our signature question, which is, who is your infatuation? Infatuation is anyone Asian that has inspired you or continues to inspire you. They can be living or deceased. So, Karen Fang, who is your infatuation?
This is such a great question. Thank goodness I had a heads up on it because I really had to think a lot about it. I know the answer ought to be Tyrus, but you know, I will say that the hubris of a biographer, and particularly if you're a biographer of creatives, is that you feel like you get to know the people already through their work because it's all out there. And so, you know, I feel like I know Tyrus like so well, like I've lived his life for so much. Like his life has been my life for the past, 7 years or so. So there are many people in his circle that like there's less that I know about. Particularly like, I don't know if you remember my mentioning Cy Young, the Disney special effects animator who was at the studio, who ended up committing suicide later. And so he's a fascinating story. So many of the Japanese American artists that were interned, whose careers were lost because of that, are fascinating stories. There's also a lot of writers. So I'm a big fan of the Chinese writer Eileen Chang. So that would be somebody I would love to talk to.
Oh, man. Okay, yeah, there's too many to choose from.
Yeah. Johnny To. I would love to meet Johnny To, the director.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, there's a lot. And the good thing for us now is that I think there's more accessibility. Like, I wouldn't know how to do a Zoom call 5 years ago, or I wouldn't know how to find certain things online. But yeah, now you can find interviews on YouTube, or you can, if you're lucky enough to connect with people, you can do a Zoom call. You don't have to visit these people in person to talk to them.
Right.
I think it's cool. It's a kind of a cool world that we're in right now. But I think that does it for our episode. So Karen, thank you so much for coming on. This is so much fun.
Thank you so much for your interest, Curtis.
Oh, no, I'm definitely interested. And everyone out there, if you want to know more about Karen, you can find her at karenfang.net, or like we said, always look up.net for more about her book. What's new for you? You got something that you're working on right now?
I am just getting into Dorothy Jenkins' story. So Tyrus's friend from Otis, she was a 3-time Oscar-winning costume designer. And so her career is so well known that I was familiar with her name when I started researching Tyrus. And then again, you sort of discover that there's so much more to the person. So I don't know where that's going to take me, but stay tuned.
Okay. I just thought that was cool that they just stayed friends for some of these pictures you have of them in their early 20s, and then they're still hanging out. And unfortunately, when you live to be 106 years old, a lot of your friends pass away along the way. And so Tyrus had to say goodbye to a lot of his friends.
Yeah.
But he hung out with them for 50, 60, 70, 80 years. That's pretty cool.
And he acquired a lot of younger admirers, and I think that helps also. So.
Yeah, that's true. So everyone, go get a copy of Background Artists, available everywhere. We recommend getting it at a local independent bookstore. And as I always mention, you can write to us at infatuasianpodcast@gmail.com and give us a follow over at Instagram at infatuasianpodcast. I'll put all of Karen's links as well as my details in the show notes. Everyone out there, thank you so much for listening. We appreciate you hanging out with us and talking about Tyrus. So on behalf of Karen and myself, until we talk to you again, bye everyone.
Bye.